Guys, tonight we're walking through the cold corridors of Hampton Court, the place where history never sleeps and the souls never really leave. The wind drifts through the red brick walls, carrying the breath of 5 centuries ago, back to a time when a young girl was too innocent to understand power, yet already old enough to know fear. Her name was Catherine Howard, the one they called the teen queen who died begging for mercy. Can you imagine that? Being Queen of England at 19 sounds dazzling, doesn't it? Until you realize your husband is Henry VIII, the man who changed wives like he changed the seasons. Trust me, if you had lived in his court, you probably wouldn't have survived long either. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. But only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And you know what? I'm always curious about the person listening on the other side of the screen, so leave a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. There are no drums to announce it, no cheers from the crowd, only the soft sound of footsteps on a cold stone floor and the scent of candle wax fading into the night. This is where the story begins, where a young lady of the Howard family smiled before the Tudor court, not knowing that same smile would lead her straight to the scaffold. You walk down the long hallway of Hampton Court, where the night air seems to coat everything with a thin layer of frost, and the faint scent of candle wax still lingers. Somewhere, the sound of a small fan blends with the whisper of the wind, creating just enough background hum for your imagination to start drifting away. There's something about this place that makes you feel not entirely alone, as if somewhere, in some hidden corner of time, a young girl is still running, silk skirts brushing against the stone floor, breath trembling, hands reaching for a door that will never open again. Her name was Catherine Howard, and tonight, Hampton Court still remembers her. Her hand remains on her hip. A thud. Catherine was born into the Howard family, a house both illustrious and cursed. They had produced queens, and lost their heads to queens as well. She didn't grow up in a palace, but in her grandmother's home, a place where young noblewomen were raised. Days were filled with scripture, music lessons, and embroidery. Nights were filled with laughter behind curtains, and the soft, secret footsteps of youth exploring its own curiosity. Catherine was the brightest among them, a flicker of fire in a room full of gray. They say that when she was only 13, she already had an admirer, Henry Minox, her music teacher. He was older, charming, and knew exactly how to make her blush. Between the lessons on the lute, there were whispered words and stolen moments she would later wish had never happened. But at that age, who truly understands that even the smallest secrets can become traps of power? Then came Francis Derham, a young man working in her grandmother's household. Catherine liked his laughter, his stories, the way he made her feel seen. They exchanged promises, gestures far too intimate to be called friendship. Some said they jokingly called each other husband and wife. Others believed they meant it. Either way, what happened in that house would never disappear. It would only sleep, waiting to awaken one day inside a king's palace. At 16, Catherine was chosen to serve as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne of Cleves, the 4th wife of King Henry VIII. The Tudor court glittered with gold and gossip, dazzling and dangerous all at once. Henry was aging then, his legs swollen with old wounds, his temper changing like the English weather. His new marriage was loveless, purely political. And then came Catherine, young, radiant, and full of laughter that seemed to wake even the dead corners of the palace. Some say that when Henry first saw her, it was as if he came back to life. He looked at her and forgot he was a man past 50. Lavish gifts followed, tender words and eyes that betrayed obsession. Catherine, flattered and bewildered, was swept away like any 17-year-old girl suddenly adored by the most powerful man in England. It felt like watching a play both romantic and doomed. A bright young girl and an aging king who thought he had found his youth again. A fairy tale that everyone knew would not end well, except the girl living inside it. Their wedding took place in the summer of 1540. Henry called her "my jewel," and the court hailed her as the youngest Queen of England. She was showered with jewels, estates, and a king's love that seemed eternal. But that love was not a warm blanket. It was a gilded cage. Catherine tried to play her part. She smiled, attended banquets, and lowered her gaze with the grace of a perfect bride. But inside, she was still the same girl who once whispered promises in candlelight. Some nights, servants saw her standing before a mirror for hours, fingers tracing the lace on her collar, eyes lost in thought. Perhaps she was asking herself, is this happiness or just another performance? Henry, meanwhile, was reborn with her by his side. He laughed again, hosted feasts, went hunting, even wrote love letters, some so embarrassingly sentimental that historians still blush reading them. But joy never lasts long in the Tudor court. Soon the whispers began. Some mentioned Francis Derham's name. Others swore they saw Catherine speaking secretly with Thomas Culpeper, a handsome young courtier close to the king. It's hard to say what was true and what was jealousy. But in the Tudor court, a rumor was sharper than any sword. One letter, one whispered word could change a life forever. There was a small story, often overlooked. Catherine kept a locked chest in her private chamber. When it was searched, they found a few keepsakes, among them old letters from Derham. To her, they were memories of youth, nothing more. But to the court, they were evidence. And evidence was never forgiven. Henry's change was immediate. The man who once called her "my pearl" began to avoid her. Soon after, he ordered an investigation. Catherine broke down, weeping, begging to see him, to explain, but Henry refused. He had already heard everything inside his own mind. They say one morning, Catherine escaped her attendants and ran through the corridors of Hampton Court toward the chapel where the king was praying. She cried his name, begged for a chance to speak, just once. But the guards stopped her. The doors slammed shut. Her sobs echoed down the stone hallways. From then on, that place was called the Haunted Gallery. Centuries later, people still say they can hear her footsteps, the rustle of silk, the faint sound of crying when the wind shifts. It sounds chilling, but strangely human. A girl once called Queen, reduced to pleading for a moment of mercy, just to tell the man she loved, "I didn't mean to." And as with all Henry's stories, the ending was inevitable. Catherine was imprisoned, questioned, and eventually confessed to part of the truth. Henry signed the death warrant, his hand trembling so badly he could barely hold the pen. Some say he wept. Some say he whispered, "I will never trust my heart again." But the sentence remained. On the morning of February 13th, 1542, Catherine Howard, not yet 20, walked to the scaffold at the Tower of London. Witnesses said she was calm, her head held high, her voice soft and steady. Her last words were recorded as, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." When the blade fell, the wind over the city seemed to pause, and perhaps somewhere far away, Henry held his breath too. You might think the story ends there, but it doesn't. Hampton Court still remembers. Night guards sometimes hear running footsteps, the whisper of silk across the floor, and faint sobs in the dark. Some say it's only legend, but if you ever find yourself there on a cold night, when the palace is empty and the moonlight pours through the windows, you might feel as though someone has just passed by. And in that moment, you'll understand Catherine never really left. She's still there, reliving her final run through time, through the breath of the wind, through the imagination of anyone still awake enough to listen. You smile softly, pull your blanket closer, and whisper, "Sleep now, little girl. The world has forgiven you." You're still awake, aren't you? Maybe it's because the wind outside keeps circling the window, like someone still wants to finish a story they never got to tell. All right then, close your eyes, take a deep breath. You're still at Hampton Court, only now the light begins to fade, and time quietly slides backward, to a few years before everything went wrong. Catherine Howard isn't a queen yet. She's just a 16-year-old girl, living in small rooms filled with laughter and the scent of powdered flowers. Every morning she ties ribbons before the mirror, humming and teasing her friends. They say her laughter could lift the whole room, light, clear, a little off-key. As if the world had never given her a reason to fear it. Back then, the Tudor court was a dazzling stage, lords and ladies in jeweled shoes and velvet coats, gold glittering everywhere, and behind the feasts, a silent game of survival. Everyone wanted to catch the king's eye, even for a moment, because that single glance could change a life. Catherine didn't know she was about to become one of those glances. King Henry VIII was in what people politely call the winter of his youth. His body was tired, his mind heavy, but his power untouched. He had loved, lost, and killed, and now all he wanted was to forget. Then came the girl, not with schemes or ambition, but with laughter. A sound so pure that in a court full of fear, she was the only one still laughing for real. You know how it is. We're always drawn to what we've lost. Henry saw Catherine, and in her, he saw his own youth, the spark he'd buried years ago. In truth, it's a familiar story. Haven't we all, at least once, fallen for a smile that felt more healing than sleep itself? At first, Catherine didn't know how to react. She received gifts far beyond her world, strings of pearls, Italian silk dresses, soft leather shoes from Venice, things she once only dared to touch with her eyes. But with every gift, Henry took a little more of her freedom. She became the center of the court, but no longer free to turn away. Once, during a banquet, Henry asked her to sing. Catherine blushed, stood up, and sang in a voice as clear as water. The sound floated across the hall, touching the candle flames, echoing off the wooden floor. Everyone applauded, and Henry's eyes filled with tears. It said that night he whispered, "She makes me forget my sins." A beautiful line, until you remember it came from a man who had executed his last wife. Catherine began to learn how to survive beneath the blinding light of power. She smiled, nodded, said what people wanted to hear. But sometimes, at night, she would sit in her grand chamber where even the candles couldn't chase away the cold. Her eyes would wander to the window, watching the guards pace outside. Maybe she thought of Francis Durham, the man who once promised to marry her. Maybe she missed those simple days when no one was watching her every breath. You see, loneliness doesn't care where you live. It can sit with you in an empty room or follow you through a golden palace. And if you've ever lain beside someone but felt a whole world apart, then you understand Catherine more than you think. Henry grew more possessive. His letters were sweet but heavy as chains. Every morning her maids would read his words aloud, and Catherine would smile. But there was something fragile inside that smile, something that sounded like breaking glass. Then one night, Thomas Culpepper appeared, a young courtier with bright eyes and a confident voice. They met at a banquet among music and wine. Just a few polite words at first, but something in that glance made Catherine feel like she could finally breathe again. Soon they were talking more, in corridors, in gardens, and then through letters. Those letters, years later, would be used against her in trial. Catherine's maid once said that whenever she heard Culpepper's footsteps outside the door, the Queen's laughter changed, lighter, more real. Maybe she knew she was playing with fire, but you know how it goes. Sometimes we reach out to the flame just to feel something true, even if it burns. Henry wasn't blind, only blind with love. Rumors reached him, and the court began to shift its tone. Catherine's smile was still there, but the way people looked at it had changed. Then one day her chest was opened, and inside were old letters, small trinkets, foolish love notes, the kind that mean nothing to youth but everything to power. The night Henry found out, he sat for hours without a word. Only the candlelight trembled against his red eyes. When he finally stood, his steps were slow, heavy, as if he were carrying a corpse, his own. By morning, Catherine was confined to her chambers. She wept, begged to see him, pleaded for a chance to explain, but Henry never came. Some say she really did run down the long corridors, gathering her dress, calling his name. The guards blocked her path. She fell, stood up, fell again. Her footsteps echoed off the walls, and then silence. Ever since, that passageway has been called the Haunted Gallery. They say at dawn, if the wind shifts, you can hear her running still. Some say it's just the wind. But those who guard the palace at night, they swear the wind doesn't cry like that. They swear the wind doesn't cry like that. When Henry finally signed the execution order, Catherine was no longer the frightened girl she'd once been. She understood everything. On her last night, she reportedly asked to practice laying her head on the block to make sure she wouldn't tremble. The guard said she smiled softly as she did it, as if she were soothing herself to sleep. The next morning, the sky was gray and the air cut like knives. She wore a black dress, lifted her chin, and walked to the scaffold. Some in the crowd wept. Others turned away. When the blade fell, there was no sound, only the silence that comes when the world itself bows its head. And tonight, as you lie there listening to the hum of your fan, imagine Hampton Court asleep, still holding Catherine's breath within its walls. If you've ever been hurt by love, maybe her spirit will sit beside you. Not to haunt you, but to remind you that some mistakes are born from the purest kind of feeling. And if you're still not asleep, that's all right. Just listen to the wind, because maybe, just maybe, it's carrying the same whispered word she cried into the darkness, still wandering through the corridors of time. A sound soft as a sigh, dissolving into the night, and finally falling asleep beside you. You're still awake, aren't you? I know. There's something about this story that won't let your eyes close just yet. Maybe it's because the wind keeps slipping through the cracks of the window, whispering the rest of a sorrow that was never fully told. All right then, let's continue. You're still at Hampton Court, only now everything has changed. No more candlelight flickering, no more feasts or music echoing through the grand halls, just silence, a heavy silence, so deep you can hear your own heartbeat. At the end of the corridor where Catherine once ran, there's only a faint glow from a guard's oil lamp. The air smells of wax, damp wood, and cold smoke, as if even the air itself still carries her memory. After Catherine's death, the English court felt as though it had been draped in an invisible mourning veil. Henry VIII, the man who once made all of Europe tremble, suddenly grew eerily quiet. Some said he stayed in his chamber for days, speaking to no one, eating nothing. Others claimed he burned everything that had ever belonged to her: dresses, jewelry, musical instruments, even their letters. Weather may burn silk and gold, it cannot burn memory. They said Henry began to dream. Every night he saw Catherine alive, smiling, calling his name, and each time he reached for her, she stepped back, fading into shadow until she was gone. He would wake drenched in cold sweat, his collar damp, his breath shaking. And in that brief moment, the man who'd condemned so many others finally learned what it was to fear himself. Years later, historians would write that Henry's reign began to crumble after Catherine's death. The treasury weakened, his body failed, and his spirit darkened like a shadow crawling up a wall. Some called it karma. Others said it was simply age. But you and I both know sometimes punishment doesn't come from heaven, it comes from memory. And Henry, above all men, had a memory that never forgot. Among the people, Catherine's story did not die with her. Servants whispered that her soul still wandered the long corridors of the palace. Some guests claimed to hear weeping when the wind changed direction, the rustle of silk in the dark, or a sudden chill as if someone had just passed by. Especially in February, the month she died, the air at Hampton Court seemed different. The wind blew stronger, and the scent of candle wax carried a metallic edge, like iron. The night guards knew better than to speak. Some cries, after all, should not be interrupted. But not everyone was afraid. There's an old tale often retold. In the 18th century, a lady traveler visited the palace under the moonlight. Walking through the corridor, she saw a young woman in a white gown facing away, her long hair cascading over her shoulders. Thinking she was a servant, the lady called softly. The girl turned around. Her face was beautiful, but her eyes were wet, as if she had been crying for centuries. Before the traveler could scream, the figure vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of jasmine and the echo of silk against stone. From then on, Londoners called her the Weeping Queen. Modern historians still debate, did Catherine truly betray Henry, or was she another victim of power and deceit? Some say she was naive, others claim she was reckless. There are even those who believe her family, the Howards, used her as a pawn to secure their power in court. The truth is, history has never been kind to women, especially the beautiful ones. And in the Tudor world, beauty could be as fatal as treason. Think about it. If Catherine had lived today, she might have just been a young woman posting smiling photos on social media, getting thousands of likes, trapped in a bad relationship. People would tell her, leave him, love yourself, not prepare for the executioner. But in her time there was no block button, only the axe. One night, sometime in 1543, a servant heard a strange noise from the king's chamber. When he entered, he found Henry sitting by the window, staring into the garden, his face pale under the moonlight. The king asked quietly, "Do you hear that?" The servant replied, "No, your majesty." Henry said nothing for a long time, then murmured, "I hear her footsteps." After that night, no one ever spoke Catherine's name in his presence again. When Henry died 3 years later, they found in his wooden chest a small silk handkerchief embroidered with silver letters, CH. No one knew where it came from. Perhaps it was a keepsake. Perhaps it was proof that even a heart of iron can still bleed. And so, century after century, Hampton Court still stands, like an old guardian keeping watch over memory. Every brick, every door frame knows this story. They just choose not to speak. Tourists come and go, taking pictures, laughing, unaware that sometimes they are standing on the very spot where Catherine once knelt and wept. Sometimes I think maybe she was never truly forgotten, because every time her story is told again, her spirit gets to hear her own voice one more time. And now in this quiet room, you're hearing that voice too. Through words, through breath, through the slow rhythm of the night. My story that seems to have fallen asleep long ago, but is really just breathing softly in the dark. You close your eyes, feeling the cold of Hampton Court still lingering in the air around you. As your breathing evens out, your mind drifts, and you hear the wind sliding across the rooftops, the faint crackle of candle flames, and a distant voice echoing from another century. I only wanted to be loved. That's all. The voice dissolves, gentle as mist. You smile faintly, letting your thoughts fade, and in that moment, Catherine is no longer a ghost. She's just a girl who once loved, once erred, and is now at peace, sleeping quietly within your own dream. You're still there, in the softened quiet of the night. The sounds outside the window have faded into the steady breathing of a world that's finally asleep. But Hampton Court is never fully at rest. There's a kind of silence here that isn't empty. It feels like something, or someone, is still waiting to speak. And strangely enough, it isn't Catherine who speaks first, it's Henry VIII. Not through words, but through the heavy stillness of a man who has lost too much to still recognize himself. After Catherine's death, Henry changed. People said he aged years within months, no longer able to carry himself with the proud stride of a king. He smiled less, hosted fewer banquets, and spent long hours by the fire, listening to the crackling wood, as if each spark were a memory of something he wished he could undo. Some nights, he ordered candles lit all across the great hall, and sat alone in their dim golden glow, staring at the tapestries that once told stories of angels. The servants thought he was praying, but in truth, Henry was simply staring at the empty space where Catherine once sat. When one of his advisors asked if he would ever marry again, Henry whispered, "No one should have to endure my heart another time." If anyone else had said it, it might have sounded like repentance. But from Henry's lips, it was more like surrender. The quiet admission of a man who no longer believed in love, nor in his own worthiness of it. Still, the kingdom had to go on. Henry signed decrees, attended councils, spoke of taxes, borders, wars. But sometimes, right in the middle of a meeting, he would stop mid-sentence his eyes unfocused and smile faintly. When asked what he was thinking, he said softly, "I heard laughter in the corridor. It sounded just like hers." Everyone fell silent because they knew the palace still kept her soul. There's a small detail most people overlook. In the year 1545, just 3 years after Catherine's death, Henry ordered the royal composer to write a piece of music for those who are gone yet still loved. It was performed only once in the chapel of Hampton Court and never played again. A court chronicler wrote that as the melody filled the hall, Henry sat still with his eyes closed, one trembling hand keeping time with the rhythm. "I couldn't tell," the writer said, "whether he was weeping or listening to someone sing along." Time moved on. Henry died, and other kings took his place. But Catherine's story refused to stay buried in history. It spread through servants' whispers, travelers' tales, and letters written by those who had seen the haunted corridors. From tragedy, she became legend. They say that on winter nights, if you walk down the haunted gallery, the air turns suddenly colder, as if someone has just passed by. Some hear crying, others smell jasmine lingering in the dark, but everyone describes the same strange feeling, a sadness so pure it isn't frightening at all. There's even a story about a young night guard assigned to his first shift. While making his rounds, he saw a woman in a white gown walking slowly ahead of him, her long hair falling over her shoulders. Thinking she was a lost visitor, he called out, "My lady, it's late." The woman turned, her face pale as mist, her eyes bright and beautiful, almost unbearably so. Then she vanished. The next morning, when he told his captain what happened, everyone went quiet. The captain only sighed and said, "If she looked at you, it means you've been forgiven." In modern times, researchers have tried setting up recorders in that same corridor, hoping to capture something supernatural. They picked up the sound of wind, the creak of doors, and one brief moment, a faint, strangled sob. No one dared claim what it was, but everyone agreed some things don't need to be explained. They just need to be heard. If you think about it, Catherine Howard was never truly frightening. Her story isn't a ghost story at all. It's the story of a girl who loved too soon, too deeply, and was punished for it. Death didn't erase her. It only made her love transparent, like a breath of cold air, a streak of moonlight, a sigh carried through ancient stone. And you? If you hear the wind whistling through your window tonight, don't rush to close it. Let it touch your hair, your cheek, like a quiet greeting, because perhaps it isn't the wind, perhaps it's Catherine, passing by, watching softly, smiling because someone still remembers her. And if you tilt your head and listen closely, you might catch a whisper, faint, almost invisible, soft as fog. At last, someone understands me. The wind eases, your breathing slows, and in that fragile space between waking and sleep, Hampton Court finally rests. The girl who once ran through the corridors has stopped. No more pleading, no more fear. Only a small warmth remains, gentle, distant, like the first calm drift of sleep finding its way to you. You're not fully asleep yet. Your eyes are only half closed, but your mind drifts somewhere between this moment and a century long gone. The night wind has softened, as if Hampton Court has finally stopped sighing, and in that quiet, the story still isn't over. Because every tragedy truly ends only when we understand why it began. After Catherine's death, it wasn't just Henry who bore invisible scars. The entire English court changed. Those who once praised the Queen of Light now spoke more softly, walked more carefully, and avoided any conversation that contained the word love. The nobles looked at each other with caution, as if every smile could one day be mistaken for a crime. In the years that followed, women of the royal household were trained more strictly than ever. Speak less, bow lower, never reveal where your heart belongs. Catherine had become a living warning for a court built on power and suspicion. They even had a phrase for it, the Howard lesson. A strange little term that sounded almost humorous, but forced hundreds of young girls to learn silence as a means of survival. You see, sometimes history doesn't kill anyone else. It just keeps people half alive, like smiling shadows. And yet, among the yellowed pages of old archives, there remain small notes about Catherine, written by those who once served her, who once loved her. One former servant recalled that even under strict watch, Catherine always tried to make others laugh. She once teased a royal cook, saying, "Your pastries are more trustworthy than the promises of men in this palace." The man repeated that line for the rest of his life, as if it allowed her to keep living, through laughter echoing in someone else's memory. There's another small detail, the kind that sends a chill down your spine. Before her execution, Catherine was handed a mirror to look into one last time. She gazed at her reflection for a long while, then said to the guard, "It's all right, I'm still me." The guard later confessed that her calm voice made his hands tremble. And perhaps that's what happens. When you've been stripped of everything, there's nothing left to fear losing. In the years that followed, when Queen Mary and then Queen Elizabeth reigned, Hampton Court was still used, restored, expanded. Yet the corridor where Catherine had run, strangely enough, was never demolished or redecorated. Those who tried to alter that part of the palace met with strange mishaps. Candles blew out in broad daylight. Workers heard whispering that called their names, or stones fell from the walls without any wind. Eventually, they left it untouched. Maybe because, deep down, everyone understood. Some pain shouldn't be covered up. It should be left there, as a gentle reminder that love without freedom becomes a curse. As for Henry, the final act of his life was like a play that had lost its audience. He married again, but sat alone in a vast palace with no joy left. His health failed, his legs swelled so much he could barely walk. Servants said that on certain nights Henry called out Catherine's name in his sleep, and when he woke he whispered, "I saw her smiling." Maybe it was just a dream. Or maybe Catherine truly returned, not to haunt him, but to forgive. Through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, curious visitors came and went. They took photos, wrote letters about the haunted palace, but if you read them closely, you'll notice something. No one was ever truly afraid. Their voices carried a kind of tenderness, as though they wished to hold that lonely spirit in their arms. A poet once wrote, "Catherine did not run to escape death but to find love. The only thing she ever believed was real." And perhaps that's why, even 5 centuries later, people still remember her, not as a sinner, but as a young woman who loved the wrong man, yet loved with all her heart. Tonight, as you lie listening to the soft hum of your fan, it sounds like the wind drifting through old corridors. If you open your eyes, your room will still be quiet, but in your mind, you're standing where moonlight pours through the tall windows of Hampton Court. At the end of the hall, you see her, a young woman in a flowing white gown, long hair loose, walking slowly. She isn't running anymore. She just moves gently, fingertips brushing the wall, as if saying goodbye to the place that once held her final fear. When she turns toward you, her face is clear, no longer the queen who begged for mercy, but simply a girl, peaceful-eyed, with the faintest smile. She bows her head slightly, as if to greet you, then the light fades. The wind passes through again, but this time it isn't cold. And so the story finally closes, not with a scream, but with a long exhale that has found its rest. You shift slightly, letting the breeze slip beneath your blanket. In that thin space between waking and dreaming, Hampton Court dissolves, leaving only your steady heartbeat and a faraway voice, warmer than before. I am at peace now, and perhaps in that very moment, Catherine Howard, the girl who once ran from death, has at last reached the end of her road, walking straight into your sleep. The night deepens. The light in your room has softened completely, leaving only the faint glow of your screen, like a single candle stubbornly staying lit, as if it doesn't want to let the listener go just yet. And you're still here, quiet, not because you're afraid, but because something in this story won't let you walk away. When we say that Catherine Howard has finally rested, it's really just history's polite way of closing an uncomfortable chapter. But some endings don't stop at the last line. They keep flowing, quietly, like an underground stream beneath layers of cold stone. After the 16th century, England changed. New kings and queens rose to power, religions shifted, old castles were rebuilt, but Hampton Court kept a part of itself unchanged: its silence. Every dynasty that came after, no matter how powerful, left that corridor alone. People said it wasn't out of superstition, but respect, because every brick there had become a witness. Once, in the early 19th century, Queen Victoria visited the palace. As she walked through the famous hallway, she suddenly stopped and gazed toward the far end. A servant later recalled that the air turned strange, not strong, but cool and sweet, with the scent of powdered flowers. The queen asked, "Do you hear anything?" Everyone shook their heads. Victoria smiled faintly and said, "How strange. I thought I'd just heard a girl laugh." From that day on, she ordered the rest of the palace to be restored, but not that corridor. She said, "Leave her there. Every castle needs a memory." Years later, when archaeologists excavated near the Beauchamp Tower, where Catherine had once been imprisoned before her execution, they found several darkened wooden fragments believed to be part of her cell door. On the surface were tiny carved marks, like symbols scratched by something sharp. One researcher believed they formed two letters intertwined, T and C. They argued for years. Some said the marks were random. Others believed Catherine had carved Thomas Culpeper's initials before she died. No one could prove it, but strangely, no one wanted to erase them either. Even now, modern visitors still tell stories that blur the line between skepticism and wonder. A couple touring the palace one winter said their camera turned on by itself. The photo it took showed only an empty hallway, but in the reflection of the glass panel there stood a young woman, head bowed, hands clasped before her as if waiting for someone. The husband deleted the photo, yet that night it reappeared in his phone's gallery. Same place, same light. When they told the guide about it, she just smiled. "Don't worry, that's the photo everyone gets, at least once." Perhaps Catherine isn't a haunting anymore. Perhaps she's just a quiet greeting from the past, a reminder that every laugh has its price, and not everyone who is forgotten has truly disappeared. Spiritual researchers call souls like hers residual echoes, imprints of emotion, repeating the same moment forever, unaware they've died. But I like to believe Catherine knows, she simply chooses not to leave. Maybe because there are still people who listen, who say her name, who understand her pain. And sometimes, that's all a spirit needs, to be understood, even once. In recent years, a group of psychologists tried to interpret the ghost of Catherine Howard in another way. They suggested that perhaps Hampton Court isn't haunted at all. It merely mirrors the emotions of the thousands who've walked through its halls, each carrying their own quiet regret. In that sense, Catherine is the reflection of every heart that's ever been broken by loving the wrong person. I like that idea, because it turns this story into something more, not just about a girl who died young, but about all of us who've run through the corridors of our own hearts, trying to escape something, when in truth, we were only searching for a place to love without fear. Now you lie there in the dim light, listening to the slow rhythm of the fan. Maybe you too have your own Hampton Court, a place in your past that still waits, still lingers. And if so, know that Catherine understands you better than anyone else could, because in the end, we're all just souls learning how to forgive ourselves. The wind slips once more through the cracks of your window. Maybe it carries a bit of England's ancient dust, or maybe it's just the clean air of tonight. But in that faint sound, you almost hear the brush of silk against stone. Soft, fading, and then gone. No one is running anymore. No one is pleading anymore. Only the small, peaceful quiet of a soul that has finally found its way home. You shift beneath the blanket, your eyes closing at last. Outside, the world murmurs softly, the heartbeat of time itself. And somewhere within that wind, a quiet laugh drifts through, youthful, free, and finally unafraid. You've drifted into that space between dreaming and waking, where the wind is no longer just wind, but memory, and time itself no longer separates. Now, from the year 1542, everything blends together, soft as mist. You're no longer in your room. You're standing in the gardens of Hampton Court at the break of dawn. The grass is still wet with dew, and the sky is shifting gently from midnight blue to pale silver. A woman walks along the stone path. Her hair is no longer golden in candlelight, but the soft gray of ash reflecting morning. In her hand, she holds a small flower. Not a rose, but lilac, the flower of regret and forgiveness. Catherine Howard. She wears no royal gown, no jewels, no crown, no guards. Just a girl walking through the morning quiet, surrounded by birds and rustling leaves. The light touches her face, and you realize that light is no longer cold. Catherine stops and looks toward the distant palace. Inside, perhaps Henry's soul still lingers, old, heavy, and lost. She smiles faintly and whispers, her voice as soft as the wind. "I forgave you long ago." At those words, something inside your chest loosens, something that had been held tight since the beginning of this story. Maybe it's hers, maybe it's yours. Because forgiveness in the end isn't for others. It's the door through which we set ourselves free. Catherine keeps walking, crossing the small bridge that leads to the back garden. On the branches, sparrows flutter their wings, shaking drops of dew that fall like tears never cried. You follow her, but with each step, your feet grow lighter, almost no longer touching the ground. The world begins to blur, melting the boundaries between person and spirit, between memory and reality. She stops in the center of the garden, kneels, and lays the flower on the earth. "This," she whispers, "is where I stop." And at that moment the air fills with a strange brightness. Not sunlight, but the kind of light that belongs to memory. Soft, clear, and warm, like a smile you've only ever seen once in your life. Catherine turns to you. Her eyes are no longer those of the frightened girl begging for mercy. They are the eyes of a soul that has understood everything, that has moved beyond fear, beyond love, beyond death. "Thank you for listening," she says. "Now I don't have to run anymore." Then she disappears, not in smoke but in light, fading gently into the morning, like mist dissolving under the rising sun. And suddenly you realize you're standing alone in the garden. But you are not cold, not afraid, only calm, as if you've just awakened from a dream you were meant to have years ago. A soft breeze passes by, carrying the faint scent of lilac. You look around. There's no one, only a small white butterfly rising from the spot where Catherine placed her flower. It circles you once, then flies toward the sky, where daylight has finally conquered the night. And in that moment, you understand, some stories aren't meant to be retold, only to be heard once, and then released. Hampton Court still stands, but now it's just an old building. No more ghosts, no more running footsteps, no more tears. Only the quietest sound, your heartbeat, steady and calm, blending with the breath of morning. Catherine Howard is at peace, and somehow so are you. The early wind glides through your hair and whispers one final sentence, so light you might think it's part of your dream. At last, everyone who is ever afraid can sleep in peace. You smile softly and lie still. No more wind, no more palace, no more past. Only sleep, deep, quiet, complete, as though Catherine herself is lulling you to rest with the first gentle breath of the morning after she was finally set free. You're still lying there, quietly in that space where boundaries no longer exist. The story seemed to have ended, and yet, like every dream with a soul, it refuses to leave completely. Because sometimes, the things that end continue to live on, not in history, but in the hearts of those still listening. You blink, and suddenly, you're standing once more before Hampton Court. But the palace is different now. There's no dampness, no shadow, only the golden warmth of afternoon. Bells ring softly from the chapel, blending with the laughter of tourists. People walk, take photos, hold up phones, smiling under the sun. And you're still there, a quiet observer among memories that have just come back to life inside you. A young tour guide with bright red hair is speaking to a group near the grand entrance. And here, ladies and gentlemen, is the famous corridor where the ghost of Catherine Howard is said to wander, forever pleading for mercy. Some claim to hear footsteps, sobbing, or a sudden chill in the air. The group murmurs, a few giggle, some shiver playfully. You just smile, not out of fear, but because you know the truth. The girl isn't running anymore, she's just listening, quietly, somewhere within the light. You step away from the crowd and follow a small gravel path leading to the back garden. The stones glitter under the sunlight, flanked by tall cypress trees. The wind carries the sweetness of warm grass and a faint trace of jasmine. With each step, old stories flicker and fade in the glow, as if Hampton Court itself is retelling its own memory. At the end of the path, there's an old stone bench, moss creeping along its legs. You sit. Before you lies a small pond mirroring the sky, still and silver like glass. For a brief moment, you no longer feel like a visitor. You feel like a keeper of stories that refuse to die. Then, from somewhere very close, a voice drifts, soft, familiar, like wind brushing through leaves. How do they tell my story now? You don't startle. The voice is warm, young, tinged with sadness, yet strangely full of light. They say, you whisper, that you ran down the corridor, crying, begging King Henry for mercy, that you were the teenage queen who died pleading for forgiveness. They say many things, but I don't think anyone ever said you were happy. Silence follows. Then a quiet laugh, airy and gentle, like the sound of bubbles rising in water. Yes, she says, I was happy once, very briefly, but truly. A breeze stirs the leaves, rustling like the soft brush of silk. You glance around, but see no one. Though you can feel her presence nearby, maybe sitting on the bench beside you, maybe leaning against a tree, the light passing through her like mist. People think I only knew how to smile, she continues, but smiling was the only way I knew how to survive. When you're surrounded by men older, more powerful, watching you as though you're an ornament instead of a person, you learn when to smile. It's the only armor you have. You stay quiet, and in that quiet you finally understand her smile, the one history dismissed as shallow, when in truth it was the last veil of dignity she had left. After a long pause, Catherine speaks again. I don't blame Henry, she says softly. He was just a man afraid of what he had created. You can't love when you've never been truly loved yourself. Her voice fades, as though she's talking to herself now. It killed me because I reminded him of something he'd lost. Youth, freedom, the part of him that still felt alive. And that terrified him. You lower your head. There's something deeply human in the way she says it. No hatred, no drama, just a quiet truth. Then she laughs again, a fragile, shimmering sound that melts into the breeze. It's funny, she says. I was once so afraid of dying. I ran, begged, pleaded to live one more day. But now I understand. Some people die so the world remembers how to feel. You look up. The pond before you glows, glassy and bright, and in its reflection stands a girl in a white dress beside you. She isn't the stiff portrait you've seen in books. She's real, gentle, warm. Her eyes carry something that steals your breath. A sadness so pure it has become peace. You know, she says quietly, no one truly wants to be a queen. Everyone thinks power means freedom, but it's only a larger, brighter cage. You nod. She gazes into the distance, where the palace shimmers in the afternoon light. I miss the nights in Norfolk, the smell of the fields, the sound of frogs. I miss running where no one watched, where no one ordered me to stop. Maybe that's what I meant when I begged for mercy, not to be spared from sin, but from the fear of losing myself. You don't reply. Some stories aren't meant to be answered, only listened to, like waves breaking on shore, again and again, never quite the same. A stronger gust ripples across the pond. When the water settles, her reflection is gone, but in its place floats a small lilac petal. The same flower. You rise, step closer, and watch it spin on the surface before dissolving into the ripples. And suddenly, you understand. Catherine was never trapped in Hampton Court. It's the living who are trapped. In fear, in guilt, in the things we cannot forgive ourselves for. The chapel bell rings again. In the distance, the tourists are laughing, children running on the grass, calling out to one another. Everything is ordinary again, as if the story you just heard never happened. But you know something did end, and something did heal. As you leave the garden, the sunlight tilts golden. A gentle breeze follows you through the stone arch, and far behind, faintly, you hear laughter. Light, young and clear as sunlight itself. No more running, no more crying. Just a girl laughing in the afternoon of the 21st century, among people who've forgotten her name but still remember what mercy feels like. You step through the gate. Cars pass, metal glints, footsteps, voices, phones ringing. Life resumes its ordinary rhythm. But inside you remains a stillness, like a door softly closing after hundreds of years. Catherine has gone, but she's left you something small, a tenderness toward your own mistakes. And so when night comes again and you lie down, something feels different. The heaviness is gone, the fear is gone. Sleep arrives, deep, luminous, as if someone is standing watch at your bedside, whispering through the quiet air. Sleep now. No one has to run anymore, and you sleep, not like someone hiding, but like someone who has finally been forgiven. The next morning, as the sun rose over the River Thames, Hampton Court opened its gates once again. Footsteps echoed across the cobblestones, cameras clicked, and laughter blended with the chirping of sparrows among the trees. Yet beneath all those modern sounds, something faint still lingered. The breath of the past. You turned back and realized the palace no longer looked sorrowful as it did the night before. It seemed alive, as though the story that had just been told helped the very walls remember how to breathe. When you stepped out through the main gate, the river that ran beside the fortress shimmered like a mirror reflecting two worlds, one belonging to the past, the other to the present. You paused, leaning against the railing, breathing in the scent of river water mixed with aged wood and metal. Tour boats drifted by, and the boatmen waved as you nodded slightly. Your thoughts still lingering behind the red walls, the story of Catherine no longer felt like a distant legend. It had become something felt, a glimmer of light dust that still floated in the quiet corners of memory. You unlocked your phone to send a few photos. In one of them, a shaft of sunlight streamed diagonally through a corridor, illuminating tiny floating particles. And in that golden glow, a faint blur appeared. Not a full figure, not a face, just the curve of a gown mid-matter. You stared for a moment, then smiled, not out of fear, but calm recognition. He understood now that Catherine wasn't trapped within stone anymore. She had become the light between dust, a soft fragment of memory anyone could touch if they paused long enough to notice. You walked along the riverside toward a small cafe just outside the gate, where black tea and warm pastries were served. The young woman behind the counter, her hair tied neatly and her smile bright as daylight, handed you a steaming cup and asked, "Did you see anything strange inside the palace? Some people say they heard someone laughing again last night." You replied quietly, "No, nothing strange." just someone who finally found peace. She smiled and said, "That's good. Whether ghost or human, everyone deserves peace." You sat under the awning, letting the scent of bergamot drift upward with the steam from your tea. A strange feeling came over you, as though Catherine were sitting nearby, also watching the people pass by with quiet ease. Perhaps she was no longer a ghost. Perhaps she had dissolved into the world, into warmth, into whispered stories at night, into that gentle light you now saw shining through your cup. Then your thoughts turned inward, to yourself. You thought of all the times you had also run, not through stone corridors, but through the winding paths of fear, regret, and self-blame. Maybe each of us has a Hampton Court of our own, a place where the past still waits, where a fragment of the soul still hasn't been forgiven. And perhaps, after hearing this story, you too are standing before your old door. You don't need to open it, just smile, the way Catherine once did. Above, the clouds drifted apart, revealing a clear sky. Sunlight stretched across the river, where small fish glimmered beneath the surface like tiny pieces of silver in motion. From across the bank, church bells rang, their sound fading softly into the wind. You finished your tea, stood, and turned to look at Hampton Court one last time. The dark red bricks shimmered in the sun, the tall windows reflecting the endless blue. For a brief moment, you thought you saw her, Catherine, walking past with her back straight, her head high and her eyes calm. No one chased her, no one locked the doors. She walked like someone who finally knew where she belonged, between the world, forgiveness, and freedom. You whispered, almost to yourself, "Thank you for letting me hear your story." Then you turned away, blending into the flow of people, your footsteps falling in rhythm with the gentle pulse of the river. Behind you, the palace melted into the sky, no longer haunted, no longer heavy, just a place that had once held love, mistakes, and release. On your way back, you stopped at the train station. Inside the carriage, passengers were busy with their phones, their magazines, their small conversations. You leaned your head against the window, watching fields, willows, and old villages slide past. Sunlight flickered across your face, soft and warm. You closed your eyes, and as the train entered a tunnel, the sound of the wheels on the tracks pulsed like a heartbeat, slowly finding rest. Somewhere, perhaps, Catherine was listening too, not in darkness, but in the small noises of everyday life. The wheels, the voices, the hum of a world still alive. True peace, you realized, isn't found in silence. It's in becoming part of life again, even if only as a breath of wind. When you opened your eyes, light flooded the carriage as the train emerged from the tunnel, everything bright and awake. You felt something inside you soften, not pity for a girl who died young, but a quiet understanding that every pain once spoken begins to heal. When the train reached the final station, you stepped out into the movement of the crowd. Overhead, the loudspeaker echoed with announcements, and the air was filled with the scent of coffee, rain, and newsprint. The world moved on, just as it did in 1542, except now, no one needed to beg for mercy anymore. The story of Catherine Howard ended not with blood, but with life. Not with tragedy, but with light. Not with tears, but with laughter carried by the wind. A small, fragile sound, yet enough to remind you that even when forgotten, humanity always leaves behind a trace of tenderness. You smiled quietly as you stepped out of the station. The London sky was impossibly blue, the wet pavement sparkling like glass beneath the morning sun. A soft breeze brushed your collar and whispered words that felt old, familiar, and kind. Sleep now. Every soul has found its peace. And you understood. It wasn't Catherine soothing you. It was you, comforting the memory within yourself, the part that once feared, once ran, once couldn't forgive. Now, at last, everything had found its way home. That afternoon, as you stepped out of the train station, the city seemed wrapped in a different kind of light. Not exactly sunlight, but something thinner, softer, a pale glow that made everything gentler, the traffic quieter, the wind less cold, the people around you walking a little slower. You moved through the streets, but your mind hadn't yet left Hampton Court. The story still lingered somewhere close, like an old perfume clinging faintly to your collar. You thought of Catherine, the young woman who once climbed the scaffold with her hair falling over her shoulders, wearing that final smile no one could quite decipher. Was it fear or peace? But strangely, as you recalled it, the heaviness was gone. In its place was calm, spreading quietly through you like the air after rain. You stopped at a small cafe by the river. The server brought a steaming cappuccino, and when you sat down, the milk foam formed a spiral, eerily similar to the ornate patterns that once adorned the Tudor ceilings. At the next table, a group of travelers were laughing about a trip to Italy. The world had changed, and yet it hadn't. People were still trying to love, to trust, to understand, and inevitably, to hurt one another. Only the setting was different. Velvet gowns had become wool coats. Palaces had turned into cafes, and the executioner's block had become an unanswered message left on read. Somewhere in memory, Catherine was still part of it all. A symbol of every time we've given our hearts to the wrong hands. Perhaps that's why her story never feels old. He gazed out the window. The sky was changing. Clouds thickened. The light shifted from gold to gray, then to deep violet. Street lamps flickered on, their reflections trembling in the water. You took the last sip of your coffee and wondered, if Catherine were born today, would she be forgiven? Maybe she'd just be a young woman who loved, made mistakes, and learned to stand again. And Henry? Perhaps just a man haunted by his own wounds, terrified of being forgotten, terrified of weakness, using power to hide that fear. One killed, one died, yet both were simply two sides of the same loneliness. He smiled faintly. You realized this had never really been a story about a king and a queen, but about people, all of us, loving the only way we know how, and paying the price for it. Outside, rain began to fall softly. Droplets streaked down the glass, long and delicate, like memories slipping out of the past. You pulled out your notebook and wrote a few short lines, not to keep, but to let go. Catherine no longer runs. Henry no longer rages. And I, the storyteller, no longer fear love. You closed the notebook and inhaled deeply. The scent of coffee mingled with the freshness of new rain. A stranger walked by, catching your eye and smiling without reason. That look, simple, unburdened, held no ghosts, only the quiet grace of the present moment. And in that instant, you could almost feel Catherine smiling too. When you stepped out of the cafe, the city had turned completely dark. Headlights scattered across the wet streets like shards of broken glass. You walked along the riverbank, each step carrying you deeper into reality, yet still echoing faintly with the rhythm of another century. On the bridge, a street violinist was playing. The melody was fragile, almost dissolving into the wind. Yet if you listened closely, it felt familiar. High notes racing like footsteps, slowing, softening, then fading like a final breath. The musician played with eyes closed, lost in reverie, while you stood still, listening as each note drifted outward and disappeared into the river. Somewhere else, Constantine stared into the river. And you thought perhaps Catherine never truly died. Perhaps she became music or wind, or the drop of rain tapping softly on someone's window when they lie awake in loneliness. And in everyone who's ever heard her story, a small piece of that soul still lives, still loves. You closed your eyes. The music, the rain, the scent of the river, all of it blended together, becoming a lullaby, not a song of death, but of acceptance, a reminder that everything eventually finds its place. The past has passed, pain as lesson, and love, even mistaken love, as something still worth remembering. When you opened your eyes, the sky was heavy with clouds, and a thin beam of light broke through, casting a silver trail across the water. You didn't know if it was the moon or a street light, only that it made your heart inexplicably peaceful. Maybe somewhere above, Catherine was watching, no longer afraid, no longer begging. She stood in the open sky, hair moving with the wind, gazing toward the ever-changing world, and smiling, as someone who had finally understood that mercy doesn't come from others, but from within. You kept walking, and when you turned for the last time, you saw the bridge, the river, the lights shimmering like countless memories burning gently in the distance. The story of Catherine Howard ended there, not in history books, but in the breath of those who listened, those who told, and those who, after 500 years, finally found peace. Night settled over London, yet within that darkness glowed a different kind of light, not from lamps or the moon, but from the compassion left behind by every soul ever spoken of with kindness. That light followed you home, quiet and warm. And as you lay your head on the pillow, the sound of the violin lingered faintly in the air, slow, tender, like a promise. Sleep, storyteller. Tonight, I'll keep your dreams. And so you slept, gently, in a world where no one had to run anymore, only souls that had finally found their way home. And then, just before the light fades completely, there is a small, weightless moment where you feel as though time has stopped. There is no past or present, no Hampton Court, no London, no room where you lie, only a hush, as if the whole world were holding its breath, waiting for one final heartbeat before the story closes. In that silence, you think about everything Catherine left behind, not titles, not sins, but an eternal question. How do you love without losing yourself? That question has crossed centuries, passed through millions of hearts, and tonight it has passed through yours. You realize that perhaps we all carry a fragment of Catherine within us, that youthful, innocent part that believes love can save everything. And we also carry a fragment of Henry, the proud, fearful part that clings to control, terrified of being left behind. But if those two parts could stop fighting, if instead of fearing we simply sat and listened, then tragedy would turn into understanding. And understanding, that is the mercy Catherine spent her entire life searching for. Outside, the rain has stopped. The sky is no longer dark, only a pale mix of ash burrow and golden light from the earliest lamps. Somewhere, a small bird calls, the first song of morning, and you know when the bird sings, it means the night has finally reached its end. So it is with the story of Catherine Howard, from the sound of frantic footsteps to the sobs to the smile, and finally to silence. There is no longer a need to beg for forgiveness, because forgiveness has already come. From within her and from all who chose to listen, you close your eyes gently. The image of the young woman fades, dissolving into the soft light of dawn, and before she disappears, she smiles, this time not in fear, but in peace. And if one night, she whispers, you ever hear footsteps running down the old corridors of Hampton Court, don't be afraid, it's only me, running one last time, not to beg, but to be free. And now the music rises, soft as mist, fading like rain, guiding the listener gently into the tender arms of night. The story has ended, but sleep has only just begun. You're still lying there, eyes half closed, hearing only the steady hum of the fan and the rhythm of your own breath. The story has reached its end, yet its aftertaste lingers in the air, like the faint scent of candle smoke after the flame is gone. Outside, the night has softened, the sky turning the color of pale silver. Somewhere, a bird wakes early and lets out a crooked note, as if it has sung its way into your dream by mistake. But that's all right. At least none of us are trapped in the dark forever. Catherine has left her corridor, and you have stepped out of your own thoughts. Two souls, 5 centuries apart, have just exhaled the same quiet breath. She found peace, and you found stillness. The breeze in your room stirs slightly, carrying a cool trace of mist, a mix of memory and calm. Your eyelids grow heavier, and all the images begin to dissolve. The palace, the candlelight, the footsteps, and the final smile of the young girl. You know, every night, there's a Catherine like that. A part of you still runs, still fears, still longs to be loved and forgiven. But like her, you'll stop, not because you're exhausted, but because at last you've understood. No one ever needs to beg for mercy for simply being who they are. Outside, the sky grows a little brighter. You shift beneath the blanket, hearing the soft brush of fabric against your skin. Smooth, warm, and human. That's all that remains now. That sound, and your breath blending into the heartbeat of the fading night. No kings, no blood, no cries for forgiveness. Only a young woman smiling as she walks through the morning mist and disappears into the dawn. You inhale deeply once more, letting your mind drift completely away. If anyone were to ask what tonight's story was about, you could answer softly. About a soul that once feared and finally learned how to rest. The breeze glides past again, gentle as a hand brushing your shoulder. You don't open your eyes. The voice of the storyteller fades, leaving only the final whisper of the night. Sleep now. The story is over, and the world is still at peace.